I'll try my best not to cry. The stable boy agreed to train for the first time, but could he handle it, all 8 of you? All characters are 18 years of age or older. Opening hook. You're shaking. That was the first thing Eli Calloway said to him. Not hello, not welcome to Hartwell Ranch. Just those 2 quiet words, dropped like stones into still water, and Sawyer Maddox felt them ripple all the way through his chest. He looked down at his own hands and realized, with a slow burn of embarrassment crawling up his neck, that Eli was completely right. Part 1. The Boy Who Didn't Belong. Sawyer Maddox had driven 4 hours through open Texas hill country to reach a ranch he had never heard of, for a job he had almost refused, arranged by an uncle who owed him nothing but gave him everything anyway. The 2-lane road had unrolled like a long pale ribbon through cedar and scrub oak, and by the time the white fence posts of Hartwell Ranch appeared on the horizon, Sawyer had managed to talk himself into something close to calm. That calm lasted until he stepped out of his truck. The ranch was enormous, the kind of enormous that makes a man feel like he accidentally wandered into someone else's life. White painted fencing stretched in every direction, dividing the land into paddocks and pastures and training rings. The main barn was a cathedral of weathered red wood with a tin roof that threw the afternoon sun back in blinding white sheets. There was a covered arena, 2 smaller outbuildings, and beyond all of it, rolling green pasture that disappeared into the hills like a painting that forgot to stop. Sawyer was 22 years old. He had the lean, restless energy of someone who had grown up working but not quite thriving, always moving, never landing anywhere that felt permanent. He stood beside his truck with a duffel bag over one shoulder and the sun in his eyes, squinting at all of it, when the barn doors slid open and a voice came out of the shadow, low and even and completely unimpressed. You're shaking. The man standing in the barn doorway was maybe 24, lean and sun-darkened, wearing worn jeans and a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark hair that curled at the ends, brown eyes the color of creek water in late summer, steady and deep, and not giving anything away. He held a laid rope loosely in one hand, and his boots were already dirty at 2 in the afternoon, which told Sawyer everything about what kind of person this was. The kind who started before dawn and didn't think about stopping. Sawyer looked down at his hands, a fine tremor, nothing dramatic. He curled his fingers around his bag strap and stood straighter. Long drive, he said. The man stepped into the light. He was taller than he had seemed in the shadow, 6'1", maybe 6'2", and he moved the way certain people move when they have spent years around animals that can feel nervousness through the ground. Slow, deliberate, like every step was a choice. He looked at Sawyer the way you look at a horse you haven't decided about yet. You Maddox, he said. Sawyer Maddox, yeah. Sawyer held out his hand. You must be the Calloway my uncle mentioned. The man looked at the hand for half a second, then shook it once. Firm, brief, Eli. Good to meet you. Eli didn't say it back. He turned and looked at the barn, then back at Sawyer with that same quiet, measuring expression. You ever worked with horses before? Sawyer hesitated, 1 second too long. Something shifted behind Eli's eyes, not contempt, more like confirmation. That's what I thought, he said, and turned back toward the barn. I've been around horses, Sawyer said quickly, because it was at least partially true. A neighbor's old mare, carrots over a fence, when he was 12. I'm not completely. There are 8 horses in this barn, Eli said, without turning around. 2 in the back pasture, 1 in the covered arena because she's in training and she doesn't like an audience. He stopped at the barn door and glanced back over his shoulder. None of them care what you've been around. They only care what you do. Sawyer stared at the back of his head. Drop your bag in the tack room, Eli said. I'll show you where everything is. Chapter 2. The Rules of the Barn. The tack room smelled like leather and saddle soap and something older underneath, the smell of years of work pressed into the wood and the walls. Bridles hung in neat rows. Saddles sat on racks by size. A whiteboard on the far wall had a feeding schedule written in precise, even handwriting, and below it, taped with a single strip of masking tape, was a hand-printed list titled, rules of the barn. There were 7 of them. Sawyer read them while Eli moved around behind him, pulling a spare pair of leatherwork gloves off a shelf and checking the fit. 1, slow movements only, no sudden gestures. 2, speak before you touch. 3, never enter a stall without announcing yourself. 4, if a horse pins its ears, you stop and you back up. 5, you do not get frustrated in this barn, leave it outside. 6, if you don't know, you ask, guessing costs. 7, the horses come first, always. Sawyer read Rule 5 twice. You write these? He asked. My dad did, Eli said from behind him. When he started the ranch, a pause, I added number 7. Sawyer turned. Eli was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and that same unhurried, watchful expression, gloves hanging from his fingers. He looked at Sawyer with the particular patience of someone who has explained the same things many times and long ago stopped being annoyed by it. You'll be on feeding and mucking for the first week, Eli said. Morning and evening feeds. I'll do the training work. You watch, you learn, you don't interfere unless I tell you to. Understood. The schedule is on the board. Breakfast feed is 5:30. Don't be late. They know the time better than you do, and if you're late, they get anxious, and anxious horses make mornings complicated. 5:30, Sawyer repeated. Bunkhouse is the small building behind the main house. You've got your own room, bathrooms shared between you and my cousin Danny, but Danny's gone to Amarillo until Thursday, so you'll have it to yourself for a few days. Eli pushed off the doorframe and tossed the gloves to Sawyer, who caught them against his chest. Come on, I'll introduce you to the horses. Chapter 3, 8 NAMES. There was a specific way that Eli Calloway moved through his barn. Sawyer noticed it on that first walkthrough and never quite stopped noticing it afterward. The way Eli's whole energy shifted the moment he crossed the threshold, the way the tension that lived in his shoulders in the outside world seemed to release the instant he was surrounded by horses and hay, and the particular golden half-light of a working barn in late afternoon. Out there, Eli was guarded. In here, he was something else. Not open exactly, not warm in any conventional sense, but present in a way that was almost startling, so completely, quietly there that the horses felt it and turned their heads toward him one by one as he walked the row of stalls, like plants turning toward light. This is Ranger, Eli said, stopping at the first stall. A big bay gelding pushed his nose toward Eli's shoulder immediately, and Eli lifted one hand and pressed his palm against the horse's broad cheek without looking, automatic as breathing. He's 12, steady, good for beginners, not that you're here to ride, but if a horse ever gets loose in the barn, Ranger's the one you can approach without worrying. Sawyer looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at Sawyer with large, liquid, profoundly unimpressed eyes. Hey, Ranger, Sawyer said. Ranger blinked. Don't take it personally, Eli said, already moving to the next stall. He's like that with everyone at first. They moved down the row. Eli named them all. Ranger, the steady bay. Mesa, a chestnut mare with a white stripe down her face who pinned her ears when Sawyer got too close and immediately unpinned them when Eli spoke to her in a low, quiet voice that Sawyer couldn't quite make out the words of. Drifter, a gray gelding with a scar on his left flank from a fence injury 2 years back, who stood with his eyes half closed in a permanent state of philosophical calm. Copper, a younger horse, only 4, with too much energy and not enough patience, who circled his stall twice, while Eli watched him with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation. He's going to be the one that tests you, Eli said about Copper. He's smart, which means he gets bored, which means he misbehaves. You always know where he is and what he's doing. Got it. Not got it like you're acknowledging a fact. Got it like you understand what bored and smart together means in a 1,200-pound animal. Sawyer looked at him. Eli looked back, not unkindly, just steady. There was a precision to the way he spoke that Sawyer was beginning to understand was not coldness, but care, a man who meant every word exactly as much as he said it, no more and no less. Got it, Sawyer said again, differently. Something shifted slightly in Eli's expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the corners of his eyes eased a little, and he turned back to the stall row. They continued. Night, a black mare with a Roman nose, and the calm, ancient dignity of a horse who had seen everything and was done being surprised by any of it. Juniper, a paint horse with enormous brown and white patches who pressed her nose against the stall bars and breathed warm horse breath directly onto Sawyer's forearm and then seemed satisfied. Ghost, a pale palomino who stood at the very back of her stall and watched them with an expression that Sawyer could only describe as philosophical suspicion. "Ghost is Eli's," said a voice from the end of the barn. Sawyer turned. A boy, 19, maybe 20, with red hair and a smudge of grease on his chin, was leaning around the corner of the last stall, grinning. He had a pitchfork in one hand and the cheerful, self-possessed energy of someone who had grown up on this ranch and felt completely at home in every inch of it. "Nobody told you to be here, Danny," Eli said, without turning around. "I got back early," Danny said, unrepentantly. He looked at Sawyer with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "You're the new guy, Pries Maddox's nephew." "That's me," Sawyer said. "Sawyer." "Danny Calloway, Eli's cousin." Danny stepped fully out from behind the stall and pointed at the pale palomino at the end of the row, the 8th horse, the one they hadn't reached yet. "Ghost has been Eli's since she was 2. He found her in a field in Kerrville County, half-starved, and bought her on the spot for $600 he didn't really have. That was 3 years ago. She still doesn't like most people." "She likes who she likes," Eli said, in the tone of someone correcting an oversimplification. "She likes you," Danny said, "and old Mrs. Patterson from down the road, for reasons nobody has ever been able to explain." He grinned at Sawyer again. "Don't take it personally if she ignores you. She ignores basically everyone." Sawyer looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at him, and then, very deliberately, turned her head away. "Yeah," he said, "I can see that." Part 2, Finding the Rhythm. Chapter 4, 5:30. He set 3 alarms. Not because he was unreliable. Sawyer had never in his life been late to a job, but because something about the way Eli had said they know the time better than you do had lodged in the back of his mind like a splinter, and he was not going to be the person who rolled into the barn at 5:35 while 8 horses vibrated with outrage against their stall doors. The first alarm went off at 4:50. He was already half awake. The bunkhouse was small and spare and smelled like cedar and old wood, and the single window in his room faced east, which meant that the very first grey light of pre-dawn was already pressing against the glass when he swung his legs over the side of the narrow bed. He dressed in the dark, jeans, a worn flannel shirt, work boots, and walked out into the cool, dark quiet of a Texas morning. The sky was that particular shade of dark blue that exists for only about 20 minutes before the sun starts pushing it toward purple and then gold. Stars were still visible in the west, fading. The air smelled like damp grass and cedar and something earthier, richer, the smell of the barn, which at this distance was just a suggestion on the breeze. Sawyer stood on the bunkhouse step for a moment and breathed it in. Then he crossed the yard toward the barn. The light was already on inside, a single overhead bulb throwing warm yellow light down the row of stalls, and the horses were already awake, heads up, ears forward, the particular alert energy of animals who knew breakfast was approaching. Ranger nickered when Sawyer slid the door open. Mesa stamped once. Copper circled and then stopped and stared with enormous, expectant eyes. Eli was at the far end of the barn, his back to the door, measuring feed into buckets with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. He didn't turn around when Sawyer came in. 4:58, he said. Sawyer stopped. "What?" "That's what time it is, 4:58. Eli picked up 2 buckets and turned, finally, and looked at Sawyer with that Creekwater gaze. "You're early." "You're earlier," Sawyer pointed out. A pause, something flickered behind Eli's eyes, not quite amusement, but a cousin of it. "Feed buckets are on that shelf," he said, tilting his head toward the wall. "I'll show you the measurements." Chapter 5, Learning the Language. The first week was hard in the way that new physical work is always hard. Muscles complaining about motions they hadn't been asked to perform before, body recalibrating, brain working overtime to learn a dozen new patterns at once. The feeding schedule, the mucking routine, which horses like to be spoken to while you worked in their stall and which ones preferred quiet, the particular combination of grain and hay and supplements that each horse got, written on a card above each stall door in Eli's precise handwriting. The way to move, always announced, always slow, always with a verbal greeting before a hand. Speak before you touch, Rule 2. Sawyer found himself saying good morning to 8 horses every single day, which should have felt ridiculous and somehow did not. Eli worked alongside him for the first 3 days, not teaching so much as simply being present, doing his own tasks, moving through the barn with that same unhurried authority, occasionally saying something quiet and precise when Sawyer made an error, never raising his voice, never expressing frustration. It was a particular kind of instruction, less like being taught and more like being watched and trusted to figure it out. On the 4th day, Eli said, "Mesa." Sawyer looked up from where he was cleaning water buckets. "She's been favoring her left front leg this morning," Eli said, leaning on the stall door with his arms crossed. "Not dramatically, just slightly, you notice it." Sawyer tried to remember the morning feed. He had noticed Mesa moving differently in her stall, a slight hesitation in the way she shifted her weight. He had filed it away without fully processing it. "I think so," he said, a little uneven. Eli nodded, slow, deliberate. "You're watching," he said, not praise exactly, just confirmation, acknowledgement of a fact. But something about it, the simple, direct recognition of it, settled warm in Sawyer's chest and stayed there. Chapter 6. The Girl in the Arena. Her name was Vega. She was the horse in the covered arena, the 9th horse on the property, the one Eli had mentioned on that first day as being in training and not liking an audience. Sawyer had caught glimpses of her through the arena fence over the first week, a dark bay mare, compact and powerful and electric, with barely contained energy, moving in circles with a particular quality of focus that was different from the other horses. Like she was always thinking, always testing. He asked Danny about her on Thursday evening, sitting on the bunkhouse steps, watching the sun go down behind the hills. "Vega's a project," Danny said, leaning back on his elbows. "Owner brought her to Eli 6 weeks ago. She's got talent, like serious talent. Eli said she could be a competition horse if someone does right by her, but she's been mishandled, not abused, nothing like that, just rushed, pushed too fast by somebody who cared more about results than the horse." He paused. "Eli doesn't rush anything." "No," Sawyer said, "I've noticed that." Danny looked at him sideways. "Has he let you watch him work with her yet?" "He works with her in the mornings while I'm doing the main barn." "He'll let you watch eventually," Danny said, "when he thinks you're ready." He picked up a piece of straw and turned it between his fingers. "That's the thing about Eli, right? He's not stingy with what he knows. He shares it in order, like you gotta build the foundation before you get the walls." Sawyer thought about that, the feeding schedule, the mucking. "She's been favoring her left front leg this morning, you notice it." "Foundation," he said. "Foundation," Danny confirmed. Chapter 7. What the Rain Does. It rained on Saturday. Not the brief, cheerful afternoon rain of summer, a genuine all-day rain, grey and steady and relentless, turning the paddocks to mud and the yard to a shallow lake, and confining everything to the barn and the covered buildings. Sawyer spent the morning doing indoor maintenance, repairing a hinge on a stall door and re-oiling a set of bridles that had been flagged on a list. The rain drummed on the tin roof overhead in a constant, hypnotic rhythm. He was halfway through the second bridle when Eli appeared in the tack room doorway. "You know how to braid," Eli said. Sawyer looked up. "Braid? Mane for showing or just for keeping it clean and untangled?" He held up a length of black mane hair. "Mesa's mane has been a disaster for 2 weeks. I keep meaning to." He stopped, shook his head slightly like he was dismissing something. "Never mind, it's not urgent." "I can learn," Sawyer said. Eli looked at him, that same measuring look, that same quiet calculation. Then he stepped into the tack room, picked up a small stool, and set it beside Mesa's stall. "Come on, then," he said. What followed was 40 minutes of Eli standing behind Sawyer's shoulder showing him how to section and braid a horse's mane, patient, precise, close. Close enough that Sawyer could smell the particular combination of soap and hay and something warm that seemed to be just the way Eli smelled, and was acutely aware of it in a way that made him focus very, very hard on the mane. Eli's hands were remarkable to watch. They moved with the confident ease of someone who had learned this when he was young and had done it so many times since that it lived in his muscle memory, efficient, gentle, quick. He guided Sawyer's hands once when the first braid went crooked, one light touch on the back of Sawyer's right hand to adjust the angle, and then stepped back immediately. "Tension," he said. "You want even tension the whole way down. Too tight and it pulls, too loose and it falls out." "Even tension," Sawyer repeated. "Everything with horses is about even tension," Eli said, more quietly, like he was talking to himself as much as to Sawyer. "Push too hard and they resist. Let go completely and they drift. You hold steady in the middle. You hold consistent." He paused. "That's the whole job, really." Sawyer worked on the braid. The rain kept drumming on the roof. Mesa stood with a resigned but cooperative stillness, occasionally turning her head to inspect what was being done to her hair with the dignified skepticism of someone who has opinions about aesthetics. "You always been here?" Sawyer asked. "On the ranch?" "Born here," Eli said from behind his shoulder. "My dad started it. He died 4 years ago." A pause, not a painful one, just a factual gap. "I took it over." "You were 20, Sawyer guessed. 21, another pause. "Danny came out to help. He's good with the business side, the numbers and the client relations. He trailed off. "Better with the horses," Sawyer finished. A beat of quiet. "Yeah," Eli said. Part 3, the pull of it. Chapter 8, small things that add up. By the end of the second week, Sawyer knew the names of all 8 horses the way he knew his own name. Not just the names, but the personalities, the patterns, the particular morning moods of each animal, the small behavioral tells that indicated comfort or anxiety, or the particular equine equivalent of "I am bored, and you should be aware this may become your problem." He knew that Ranger always wanted his nose scratched first, before anything else, and would lean into it with his eyes half closed like a large, dignified dog. He knew that Ghost still turned her head away when he entered her stall, but had stopped backing up, which Danny, grinning, had informed him was massive progress. He knew that Copper's restlessness peaked around 3 in the afternoon, and that a walk around the paddock, not a full exercise, just a walk, just movement, was the difference between a manageable evening and a complicated one. He had learned these things partly from the cards above the stall doors, and partly from Danny's running commentary, and partly from 2 weeks of daily observation. But mostly, and this he could not have said clearly even to himself, he had learned them by watching Eli. The way Eli was with horses was the kind of thing that you couldn't look directly at for too long, the way you can't look directly at the sun. It was too precise, too revealing. Eli was a different person in that barn than he was anywhere else. Not warmer, exactly, not more talkative, but open in some fundamental way, like a window that was always slightly cracked, but only fully opened in here, in this space, with these animals. When Eli worked with Vega in the covered arena, Sawyer began finding reasons to be near the arena fence. Not watching overtly, he had a sense that overt observation would be unwelcome, but present at the edges, close enough to see if he happened to look up from whatever he was doing. What he saw when he happened to look up was this: a man and a horse in a conversation. That was the only way Sawyer could describe it. Eli worked Vega on a long line first, asking for transitions, walk to trot to canter, and watching her response the way you watch someone's face when you say something important. Reading, adjusting. When Vega resisted, Eli didn't push back. He waited, still and patient, until she softened and offered the movement herself. When she offered something good, Eli's whole body changed, a slight ease, a slight warmth, a quiet sound that was not quite a word, but that Vega clearly understood as approval. Sawyer watched all of this from the fence and felt something complicated happening in the center of his chest that he was not yet ready to examine closely. Chapter 9: The First Real Conversation. 3 weeks in, on a Tuesday evening when Danny was in town and the barn work was done and the horses were settled and the sky was turning spectacular colors over the western hills, Eli came and sat on the top rail of the paddock fence 6 feet from where Sawyer was standing. He had a coffee mug in one hand and said nothing for a full 3 minutes. Sawyer, who had been thinking about the horizon, did not say anything either. They watched the sky go orange and then deep pink and then the particular bruised purple that came right before the stars appeared. "You're from the city," Eli said eventually. "San Antonio," Sawyer said. "Not the city, but yeah." "What did you do before this?" "Worked in a warehouse for a year after high school, then did some landscaping, then drove a truck for a while." He paused. Nothing that stuck. Eli was quiet. "That sounds worse than it is," Sawyer said. "Doesn't sound bad," Eli said simply. "Sounds like you were looking for something." Sawyer turned his head and looked at Eli's profile against the deepening sky, the clean line of his jaw, the way he held the coffee mug with both hands like he was cold, which seemed unlikely given the lingering warmth of the evening. He was looking at the horizon with that same expression he wore when he was watching Vega, not blank, not checked out, but deeply present, thinking. "Maybe," Sawyer said. "What made you say yes to this?" Eli asked. "Your uncle set it up, but you could have said no." It was a more direct question than Sawyer had expected from him. He thought about it honestly. "I needed a change," he said. "Something with my hands, something with I don't know, something alive, something that required me to pay attention." Eli turned and looked at him then. Directly, steadily, for a long moment that lasted 2 or 3 seconds, but felt longer, felt weighted with something Sawyer couldn't fully name. "You're paying attention," Eli said. He turned back to the horizon and drank his coffee, and Sawyer stood there with the feeling of those 3 words sitting in the space between his ribs, warm and undeniable, and not going anywhere. Chapter 10: What Danny Notices. "Okay," Danny said, on Wednesday morning, with the tone of someone who has been sitting on a thought and can no longer justify the sitting. Sawyer looked up from the feed buckets. "Okay, what?" "Nothing," Danny said, and then immediately, "It's just, Eli let you braid Mesa's mane." Sawyer stared at him. "Yes." "He taught you, like hands-on, standing right there taught you." Danny leaned on the stall door with an expression of theatrical significance. "Do you know how long I've been here? 5 years. 5 years, and Eli has never once offered to teach me to braid a mane. I learned from watching YouTube videos." "Danny." "I'm just observing a fact," Danny said cheerfully. "A notable, significant, what some might call interesting fact. That's all. I'm not making any kind of larger point." He paused. "I'm absolutely making a larger point." "I work with the horses," Sawyer said carefully. "It's relevant to the job." "Sure," Danny said. "That's definitely what it is." He picked up a pitchfork and walked away whistling. Sawyer looked at Mesa. Mesa looked back at him with her large, dark, entirely unhelpful eyes. "Don't start," he told her. She blinked. Part 4: The Complicated Part. Chapter 11: Vega. On the first day of the 4th week, Eli said, "Come watch." Just that, come watch, 7 a.m. Sawyer had finished the morning feeding and was starting on water buckets, and Eli appeared at the barn doorway in his work clothes, with his gloves tucked in his back pocket, and that unreadable, steady expression. Sawyer set down the water bucket and followed him to the covered arena. Vega was already there, turned out in the large space, moving freely without a line, just running the way horses sometimes need to, burning energy that had built up overnight, mane flying, hooves throwing up small clouds of arena dirt. She was extraordinary. Even to Sawyer's still learning eye, she was obviously extraordinary. The way she moved had a quality he could only think of as music, a rhythm and cadence and grace that seemed almost too intentional to be natural. He stood at the arena rail and watched her, and forgot for a moment to be self-conscious about standing next to Eli. "She's beautiful," he said without thinking. He felt rather than saw Eli turn to look at him. "Yeah," Eli said quietly, "she is." Sawyer looked over. Eli was looking at Viga, but there was something soft in his expression that was different from his usual watchfulness, something unguarded, something that belonged entirely to this private moment in this covered arena, and Sawyer felt acutely like he was seeing something he had not been intended to see and was glad he had. Eli worked her for an hour. Sawyer watched all of it. By the end, he understood something that he hadn't before, that what Eli was doing was not simply training a horse. It was something more like a negotiation, a genuine, ongoing negotiation between two intelligent beings with different languages and the shared project of learning to understand each other. Eli brought patience and consistency and the deep knowledge of someone who had given years to understanding this particular kind of communication. Viga brought talent and wariness, and, increasingly, a trembling willingness to trust. When the session ended and Eli brought Viga to a halt at the center of the arena, the horse blew out a long breath and dropped her head, and Eli walked to her immediately and rested his forehead against the side of her neck for a moment. Eyes closed, just that. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then he stepped back and began the cool-down process, professional and focused again. The door closed. But Sawyer had seen it, and something shifted in him that did not shift back. Chapter 12, The Thing That Changes. It happened on a Thursday. There was a client at the ranch, a woman named Lorraine Marsh, 40-something, polished, with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up with money and horses and understood both fluently. She had brought a horse to Hartwell for evaluation, a young grey gelding with excellent bloodlines and unresolved behavioral issues, and she stayed the better part of the afternoon while Eli assessed him. She was charming and professional and clearly respected Eli enormously. She also, Sawyer noticed, found reasons to stand very close to Eli whenever the opportunity presented itself, and touched his arm twice during their conversation, and laughed at things he said with a warmth that was more than professional courtesy. Eli, for his part, was perfectly pleasant and entirely focused on the horse. If he noticed the extra closeness, he gave no indication. Sawyer was supposed to be cleaning tack in the barn. He was mostly staring through the barn window at the covered arena. "You're watching," he told himself, with an irony that landed somewhere between the humorous and the uncomfortable. "You're definitely watching." When the client left at 4:30 and Eli came back to the main barn, Sawyer was very carefully and thoroughly cleaning a bridle that he had already finished cleaning 20 minutes ago. "Viga made good progress today," Eli said, pulling off his gloves. "Despite the interruption," he paused. "You good?" Sawyer looked up. Eli was watching him with that steady, attentive expression, the one that felt like it didn't miss much. "Fine," Sawyer said. "Good, yeah." Eli held his gaze for a beat longer than the exchange required, then nodded. "Feeding time," he said, and went to the feed room. Sawyer set down the bridle and pressed his palms flat on the work table and took a long, slow breath. Even tension, he thought, hold steady in the middle. Chapter 13, The Night Conversation. He couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for him. Sawyer had always been a light sleeper in new places, and while the bunkhouse felt less foreign than it had in week 1, there were still moments of 2 a.m. wakefulness where he lay staring at the ceiling and listening to the ranch settle around him. The creak of the main house, the distant sound of a horse moving in the barn, the wind through the cedar trees. On this particular night, he gave up at midnight and went outside. He sat on the bunkhouse step in the dark and looked at the stars, which in this part of Texas were extraordinary, close and thick, and almost arrogantly bright, the Milky Way a full visible smear across the sky. He sat there for a while just breathing, not thinking about anything in particular, or rather thinking about too many things to organize into anything coherent. He heard the main house screen door open and close, footsteps on the gravel path. He expected Danny, but it was Eli. Eli stopped when he saw Sawyer, then continued toward him and sat on the other end of the bunkhouse step with the easy, unsurprised manner of someone for whom unexpected midnight encounters have long since ceased to require explanation. He had a bottle of water, and he held it loosely between his knees and looked at the stars. "Couldn't sleep?" Sawyer asked. "I do this sometimes," Eli said. "Middle of the night, when things are loud up here." He touched his temple briefly. Sawyer nodded. They sat in the dark and the quiet, and the stars blazed overhead, and after a while the silence became the comfortable kind, the kind you only get with certain people when the absence of talking is not emptiness but presence. "Can I ask you something?" Sawyer said. "Sure. What are you afraid of?" He wasn't sure where the question had come from. He heard himself ask it and felt slightly surprised at himself, and for a moment he thought Eli would redirect it or deflect it with something dry and minimal. But Eli was quiet for a moment in the thinking way, not the defensive way, and then he said, "Becoming someone who stops trying." Sawyer turned his head and looked at him in the dark. Eli was still looking at the stars, profile quiet and serious. "What does that mean?" Sawyer asked. "My dad worked himself to the bone for this ranch," Eli said. "Loved it completely, gave everything to it. And then one day he just couldn't anymore. Heart attack, 56 years old." He paused. "I watched someone who cared more than anyone I've ever known just stop. It scares me that I might stop before I've done what I'm supposed to do. He stopped, shook his head slightly. "That probably doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," Sawyer said. Eli turned and looked at him. Their eyes met in the dark, and the moment stretched out the way moments sometimes do when they've decided to matter, slow and significant and lit from inside. "What are you afraid of?" Eli asked. Sawyer thought about the honest answer. "Not being enough," he said. "Working at things and finding out I don't have what they require." Eli held his gaze. "You have what the horses require," he said. "You've had it since the second week." Sawyer felt something open up in his chest, wide and warm and slightly terrifying. "That's not everything," he said. "No," Eli said, "it's not." A pause, small and loaded, "but it's something." They sat there under the stars for another hour, talking in the way that only seems to happen at night, without performance, without the self-consciousness of daylight, just two people being honest in the dark. Eli talked about his father, about the 4 years since, about the loneliness of being the person everyone depends on. Sawyer talked about San Antonio, about growing up without a clear map, about the particular exhaustion of moving through the world feeling like you'd been dropped in the wrong life. When they finally went back inside, Sawyer stood at the bunkhouse door and said, "Thank you for talking with me." Eli paused on the path and looked back. In the dark, with starlight on his face, he looked young. He looked, Sawyer thought, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was periodically surprised by the existence of people willing to share the weight. "Yeah," Eli said quietly, "you too." Part 5, The Distance. Chapter 14, Something Changes in Eli. After the night on the step, something shifted. Not between them, exactly, or rather, something shifted in Eli. A withdrawal so gradual that Sawyer wasn't certain at first that it was real. That he wasn't simply projecting something onto the ordinary patterns of a busy man's working days. But it was real. The easy silence of the barn became slightly guarded. The moments of direct conversation became shorter. Eli moved through his days with his usual efficiency and competence, but there was a new careful quality to his interactions with Sawyer, a slight, deliberate increase in the space between them. Sawyer noticed it the way you notice a temperature drop, slowly and then all at once. He didn't say anything. He thought about Rule 5, you do not get frustrated in this barn, leave it outside. He tried to apply that to himself as much as the horses. He showed up at 4:58, he did his work. He spoke before he touched. He watched for what needed watching. Danny noticed, because Danny noticed everything. He said nothing directly, but started showing up in the barn with more frequency, filling the spaces with his easy chatter, cushioning the slight new awkwardness with the generosity of someone who understood more than he let on. Chapter 15, The Client Returns. Lorraine Marsh came back. She came back on a Wednesday with the grey gelding for a follow-up evaluation and stayed for lunch, which Danny prepared with the careful attention of someone who had been asked nicely to make himself scarce for the afternoon. She sat with Eli on the porch of the main house, and from across the yard Sawyer could see them talking, Eli with his coffee, Lorraine with a glass of sweet tea, the particular posture of a comfortable professional relationship edging towards something warmer. Sawyer mucked stalls with a focus that was perhaps disproportionate to the task. Copper watched him from his stall with alert, knowing eyes. "Don't say a word," Sawyer told him. Copper flicked an ear. By the time Lorraine left and Eli came back to the barn for the evening feeding, Sawyer had achieved a level of equanimity that he was fairly proud of. Calm, professional, fine. He measured out feed buckets with precise attention and did not acknowledge that anything felt different. "Lorraine wants to bring the gelding on full," Eli said, filling water. 6-week training commitment. "That's good," Sawyer said. "More work." "More work," Eli agreed. A pause. "She asked about you." Sawyer stopped. "What?" "She asked who the new hand was." Eli's voice was entirely neutral. "I told her you'd been here a month and that you were working out." Sawyer turned and looked at him. Eli was looking at the water bucket, profile unreadable. "Okay," Sawyer said. "She said you seemed—" Eli stopped, picked up the full bucket. "Never mind." "Seemed what?" Sawyer asked. Eli finally looked at him. His expression was controlled and careful, and there was something underneath it, something that lived in the slight tightness around his eyes that Sawyer couldn't read. "Good at your job," he said. "She said you seemed good at your job." He carried the water bucket to Mesa's stall and didn't look back. Chapter 16, Ghost. Ghost let Sawyer touch her for the first time on a Friday in the 5th week. He hadn't pushed it. He had been patient in the way that Eli's rules and Eli's example had taught him to be patient, arriving at her stall every morning with her feed, speaking to her quietly, offering his hand over the stall door, withdrawing it without reaction when she turned away. Day after day, week after week. He had almost given up on the particular significance of it, had almost talked himself into being fine with Ghost's permanent philosophical suspicion, when he came in on that Friday morning and put his feed bucket down outside her stall and said, "Morning, Ghost," and held out his hand, and Ghost walked forward and pressed her nose into his palm. Sawyer stood very still. The contact lasted maybe 10 seconds, soft horse breath on his fingers, the warm weight of her nose in his hand, the enormous quiet dignity of a trust extended after long deliberation. Then she stepped back and turned her head slightly, as if the gesture had been a small thing rather than the significant thing it obviously was. "Okay," Sawyer said, very quietly. His voice was not entirely steady. He was still standing there when Eli appeared at the end of the stall row. Eli stopped, looked at Ghost's stall, looked at Sawyer's face. Something happened in his expression, a rapid, involuntary sequence of things that were all there and gone before Sawyer could fully catalogue them. Surprise, something soft and undeniable, something that looked, for just a moment, like it might become something said. Then Eli looked away and walked to Ranger's stall, and the moment passed. "Good," he said quietly, to the space between them. "Just that, good." But he said it the way you say a word when you mean it entirely. Part 6, The Breaking Point. Chapter 17, What Danny finally says. Danny found Sawyer at the paddock fence on a Sunday afternoon, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of someone conducting an internal argument that was not going especially well. He leaned on the fence beside him and looked at the same patch of nothing for a while, then said, "You know I was the one who suggested to Uncle Prees that he send you here." Sawyer turned. "What?" "Eli needed help, and I knew Prees had a nephew who was, I don't know, looking for the right thing." Danny looked at the paddock, casual and careful at once. "I saw Eli's face when Prees described you and I thought, yeah, this could be good." "You saw his face when your uncle described a person he'd never met." "Eli is very expressive," Danny said, "to people who know how to read him, which is approximately 3 people in the world, and I'm one of them. He paused. He's scared, Sawyer. Of what? Danny looked at him with the kindly patience of someone explaining something to a person who already knows the answer. Of exactly what you'd think, he said. Of wanting something, of having it matter. He stopped, picked a splinter off the fence rail. His dad died when Eli was 21. He's been the responsible one, the dependable one, the person who holds everything together for 4 years. He doesn't let himself want things that feel risky. A pause. You feel risky to him. Sawyer stared at the paddock and felt the information settle through him like water through dry ground, absorbed immediately, completely, irreversibly. I'm not going anywhere, he said. He doesn't know that, Danny said, and more importantly, he doesn't know if he deserves to believe it. He straightened up and pushed off the fence. I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you what's true. He walked back toward the house, and Sawyer stood at the fence alone, and in his chest, something quiet and determined took root. Chapter 18, The Storm. The storm came in fast, the way Texas storms do, a wall of dark cloud building in the southwest through the afternoon, and then arriving all at once at 9 in the evening, wind before rain, the horses responding before the first drop fell. Sawyer was in the barn doing a final check when he felt the pressure change and heard the horses' collective energy shift, a subtle restlessness moving through the stalls like a tide. Eli was there 20 seconds later. The horses knew the storm was coming, and they trusted Eli's presence. He moved through the barn with calm authority, speaking quietly to each horse, checking stall latches, pausing longest with Copper, who was circling again with wide eyes. Extra hay in each stall, Eli said, without preamble, already moving. It gives them something to do, keeps the anxiety down. On it, Sawyer said. They worked in parallel, fast and focused, the way they had been working for over a month now, no wasted motion, no unnecessary communication, a wordless efficiency built from weeks of shared routine. The wind picked up outside. The tin roof groaned. Lightning lit the gap under the barn door in stark white sheets. Copper was the problem. He was 3 steps from panic, eyes white-rimmed, circling fast, breathing hard. Sawyer had extra hay in his hands, but Copper was too agitated to settle, and forcing it would make things worse. Eli was already there, inside the stall, doing the thing that Sawyer had watched him do a dozen times, planting himself in the animal's space, still and steady and radiating a calm that had to be a choice, because no human being felt calm with a panicking 1,200-pound horse. And yet Eli chose it, held it, offered it. Talk to him, Eli said, without looking up. Sawyer blinked. Me. He knows your voice now, use it. Sawyer stepped to the stall door and started talking. He wasn't sure what he said, something low and steady and continuous, the verbal equivalent of I'm here, this is fine, the storm is outside, and you're inside and nothing is going to get you, and after a minute, he felt Copper's energy shift, not settle completely, but come down a step, then another. Copper turned his head and looked at Sawyer with those enormous eyes, and Sawyer kept talking, and Eli stood perfectly still beside the horse, and outside the storm broke, and rain hammered down on the tin roof in a continuous roar. It took 15 minutes. When Copper finally dropped his head and sighed that long, shuddering horse sigh that meant the panic had passed, Eli laid his hand briefly on the horse's neck, then stepped out of the stall and latched it behind him. He looked at Sawyer in the warm yellow barn light, rain absolute outside, both of them slightly damp from the sprint across the yard, and for a moment he looked entirely open, unguarded, present, and something else. Good, he said again, but this time it came out differently. Lower, warmer, less of a report and more of a feeling. Sawyer held his gaze. Eli, he said. Don't, Eli said, immediately, quietly, but not cold. The word was a door with its hand on the handle, not quite closed. I haven't said anything yet, Sawyer said. I know what you're going to say. Then you know it's true. Eli looked away. He looked at the rain-dark gap under the barn door, jaw set, and the careful control in his expression was the most human thing Sawyer had ever seen, someone holding themselves together with both hands because the alternative was something they didn't know how to manage. "I don't do this," Eli said. "I know." "I can't," he stopped, shook his head. "You don't have to," Sawyer said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what's true, because you told me the truth on the step that night, and it seemed right to give you the same thing." Eli turned and looked at him. In the barn light with rain on the roof and 8 horses settled quietly around them, and the particular intimacy of a shared crisis resolved, he looked young and tired and real in a way that made Sawyer's chest ache. "I'm scared," Eli said, plainly just that. "I know," Sawyer said, "me too." Part 7, The Distance Grows. Chapter 19, 3 Days of Quiet. Eli was not cold to him in the days that followed. That would have been easier. Cold would have had the clarity of a defined thing, a thing with edges that could be navigated. Instead, Eli was simply careful. He was competent and professional and present in all the ways the job required. He showed up at feeding time, gave instruction when instruction was needed, watched Viga's training progress with focused attention. He did not avoid Sawyer. He did not treat him differently in any way that Danny or a stranger could have pointed to and named. He simply held, very carefully, a specific distance. Sawyer respected it. He had meant what he said, that he wasn't asking for anything, that the telling had been the thing in itself. He showed up at 4:58, he worked, he talked to the horses, he was patient. But in the quiet of his bunkhouse room at night, patience was harder. He thought about Eli with his forehead against Viga's neck, eyes closed. About Eli on the step at midnight, looking at the stars and talking about his father. About the look on Eli's face, the morning ghost pressed her nose into Sawyer's palm. He thought about all the small, accumulated evidence of a person who felt things deeply and had learned to regard the depth of his own feeling as a hazard. He thought, "I have all the time in the world, and I will wait." Chapter 20, What Viga Tachs. On the Thursday of the 6th week, Eli came to the barn at noon instead of morning and said, "Come to the arena." Not come watch, just come. The distinction felt meaningful. Sawyer followed him to the covered arena, and Viga was there, turned out and moving with the extraordinary fluid grace that Sawyer now recognized as her particular genius, and Eli stood at the center of the arena with the long line coiled over his arm and looked at Sawyer. "She's ready to work with someone else in here," Eli said. "She needs to learn that the connection she has with me isn't exclusive, that she can work with other people and trust is still safe." He held out the long line. "I want you to take this." Sawyer stared at him. "I don't know how to." "I'll talk you through it," Eli said. "Every step. You won't be doing anything without guidance, but she needs to hear your voice in here, in this context. She needs to associate your presence with safety." He paused. "You've been doing that from outside the fence for 3 weeks. Now we do it inside." Sawyer took the long line. His hands were steady. Eli stood behind his shoulder and talked him through it, quietly, precisely, the way he always talked about the things he knew deeply. And Viga moved in her circle, and Sawyer held the line with even tension. And after 20 minutes, Viga transitioned from trot to canter on his ask for the first time, and the feeling of it, the gorgeous, immediate, living response of an extraordinary animal to his request, went through Sawyer like electricity. He turned to look at Eli. Eli was watching him with an expression that he did not try to hide or adjust or control, just open and clear and full of something that was larger than the moment required. His eyes were bright. "She trusted you," he said. "She trusted your preparation," Sawyer said. Eli shook his head slightly, like dismissing the deflection. He stepped forward and took the line from Sawyer's hands, and for a moment they were both holding it, Eli's fingers overlapping Sawyer's, and neither of them let go immediately. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Eli stepped back, and the moment passed, and they finished the session in the same companionable focus that had always characterized their best working hours together. But something had changed. The careful distance was still there, just barely, but it had become, Sawyer thought, more like a question than a wall. Part 8, The Truth of It. Chapter 21, 6 weeks in. On Saturday evening of the 6th week, Danny made dinner. A real dinner, not the usual ranch-efficiency meals of quick proteins and vegetables, but an actual dinner, with a pot of chili and cornbread and fresh sliced tomatoes from the garden and the good glasses out on the porch table. And he set everything up outside in the warm evening air and called them both from the barn with the enthusiasm of someone who had decided that an occasion was happening, and that was simply final. They ate, the three of them together, as the evening cooled and the stars appeared, and Danny steered the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had thought about this in advance. Funny stories about the ranch, questions about Sawyer's life before, memories of Eli's father that were warm and fond, and made Eli smile in a way he didn't often, the particular smile that softened the watchfulness in his eyes and made him look completely like the person he was when he was with the horses. Sawyer watched that smile and held onto his good sense with both hands. After dinner, Danny said he had a call with his girlfriend in Amarillo, said it with the transparent cheerfulness of someone who absolutely did not have a call with his girlfriend in Amarillo, and went inside, and the screen door swung shut behind him, and Sawyer and Eli were alone on the porch, with the last of the chili going cold in the pot, and the sky doing its extraordinary Texas thing overhead. Eli was quiet for a long time, a comfortable quiet, but with weight in it, the weight of something that had been thought about and not yet said. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Sawyer looked at him. "For what?" "For pulling back." Eli looked at the table, turned his glass once. "After the night on the step, I got scared and I put distance there, and that was unfair to you. You hadn't done anything wrong." "I knew why," Sawyer said. "Knowing why doesn't make it right." He looked up. "You've been patient with me. You didn't make it harder. I want you to know I noticed that." "Eli." "I'm not good at this," Eli said. The words came out careful and honest and slightly effortful, like lifting something heavy. I don't do this. I've spent 4 years being the person who holds things together, and it didn't leave room for this kind of thing. I forgot how." He paused. "Or maybe I'm not sure I ever knew." Sawyer waited. "But I think about what you said," Eli said more quietly. "In the barn, during the storm. I think about it a lot, actually." "What part?" Sawyer asked. Eli looked at him directly, and his expression was open and steady and real and slightly terrified in the way that honest things always are. "That you were telling me what was true," he said, "because I told you the truth." He paused. "I haven't had that in a long time, someone who meets it like that, straight on." Sawyer set his glass down. He thought about 8 horses and 1 impossible assignment, and a man who could train an extraordinary animal by holding steady in the middle. He thought about even tension and the rule that said the horses come first, and the person who had added that rule himself at 21 when he became responsible for everything. "I'm not leaving," Sawyer said. "I don't mean that as pressure, I mean it as information." Eli was very still. "I've been looking for the right thing for 2 years," Sawyer said. I think I found it." He paused, and then, because honesty was what they had built, because it was the foundation they had laid brick by slow, careful brick over 6 weeks of 5:30 mornings and storm nights and starlit steps, he said, "Both things, the ranch and you." Eli closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the careful control in his expression had released, not collapsed, but released, the way a held breath releases, slow and complete. He looked at Sawyer with something so direct and so unguarded that Sawyer had to resist the impulse to look away from the force of it. "I don't know how to do this without messing it up," Eli said. "Neither do I," Sawyer said, "but you just told me that if a horse offers you something good, you receive it. You don't ask it to prove itself first. You just receive it." Eli stared at him. Something moved through his expression, recognition, then something warm and undeniable. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I've been paying attention," Sawyer confirmed. Chapter 22, The Closing of Distance. Eli reached across the table. It was a small gesture, his hand, palm up, resting on the table between them, an offer rather than a demand, the way all genuine offers are made. Sawyer looked at it for exactly 1 second, and then he placed his hand in it, and Eli's fingers closed around his, warm and certain. They sat like that in the dark with the stars overhead and the horses settled in the barn and the ranch quiet around them, and Sawyer felt something in himself that he had been carrying at a low, constant hum for the past 6 weeks. Release and settle. Not resolved, not finished, beginnings never are, but true. Undeniably, completely true. The horses are going to know, Eli said after a while. His voice was different, lower, quieter, something private in it that Sawyer had not heard before. Sawyer laughed, really laughed, the surprised, full kind, and Eli looked at him with startled eyes and then slowly smiled. Not the professional, minimal kind, the real kind. The one Sawyer had seen only in the barn when things went right with the horses, the one that changed his whole face. It was, Sawyer thought, an extraordinary smile. Ghost will probably tell everyone, Sawyer said. She's been a gossip since she was 2, Eli agreed, and there was warmth in his voice that was entirely new, or rather, not new, just finally unfrozen, finally allowed out into the air. They stayed on the porch until nearly midnight. They talked the way they had talked that first night under the stars, honestly, without performance, in the specific freedom of 2 people who have agreed to be known by each other. Eli talked about the ranch in a way he hadn't before, not the management of it, but the love of it, the particular love that had grown through grief and obligation into something genuine and entire. Sawyer talked about San Antonio, about his parents, about the slow-building suspicion over the past 2 years that he was meant for something that involved his hands and something living and something that required his whole attention. Around 11, Eli said quietly, "I'm glad you didn't say no. To the job. To all of it." Sawyer looked at him in the dark, at the clean profile, the now familiar angles, the creekwater eyes that in this light were almost black, at the person who had trained a frightened horse back to trust through patience and steadiness, and the simple, radical act of showing up every day without agenda. "Yeah," Sawyer said, "me too." Part 9, The Morning After the Beginning. Chapter 23, 4:58. He woke up at 4:50 without an alarm. The sky outside his window was the dark pre-dawn blue he knew now as well as his own breathing, 20 minutes before the sun began pushing it toward purple and gold. He lay still for a moment listening to the ranch, the cedar trees, a horse moving in the barn. He got up, dressed in the dark, went outside. The light in the barn was already on. He was not surprised by this. He stood in the cool dark for a moment looking at the warm rectangle of light under the barn door and felt something that he could only call rightness, a deep, uncomplicated, bone-level sense of being in the correct place at the correct time doing the correct thing, which he suspected was one of the rarer experiences available to a person and should not be taken lightly when it arrived. He crossed the yard and slid open the barn door. Eli was at the feed shelf, measuring grain. The horses were awake and alert, Ranger already at his door nickering, Copper already circling. Ghost's pale form was visible at the back of her stall, watching the doorway. Eli turned when Sawyer came in, and for a moment he just looked at him, morning-lit, steady, the watchful expression that Sawyer had spent 6 weeks learning to read. Then the corners of his eyes eased, and he turned back to the feed buckets. 4:58, he said. "Every morning," Sawyer said. "Every morning," Eli agreed, and there was something in the repetition of it that felt like a promise, not performed, not dramatic, just true, the way the feeding schedule was true, the way the rules were true, the way the horses knew the time better than you did, and you showed up anyway. Sawyer picked up the feed buckets and started down the stall row, 8 horses, one at a time, beginning at the beginning. Mesa lifted her head when he came to her stall, and her ear flicked toward him in the particular way that meant she had been waiting. He measured her feed and opened the stall door, and she stepped aside to make room for him with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to being known. "Morning, Mesa," he said. She went directly to her feed bucket and began eating with focused, dignified appreciation. Sawyer moved on down the row. Chapter 24, Vega's Progress. 3 days later, Vega let Sawyer work her on the long line alone. Eli stood at the arena rail. He did not intervene, did not instruct, just watched, with the careful, intent attention he gave to all things that mattered. Sawyer worked Vega through her paces, walk, trot, canter, ask and receive, hold even tension, give and take, the ongoing negotiation of two beings learning the grammar of each other. Vega moved beautifully. She was always going to move beautifully, that was in her, baked into the architecture of her by the particular luck of breeding and bone, but today she moved with a freedom and ease that Sawyer had not seen from her before, a looseness in her top line, a willingness in her transitions, a quality of attention directed toward him that felt like the equine version of being trusted. When he brought her to a halt at the center, and she sighed and dropped her head, Sawyer stood beside her for a moment with his hand on her neck, feeling the warmth of her and the slow rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, and felt a gratitude for this, for the specific, daily, difficult, beautiful work of learning the language of something that could not speak and could not lie, that was too large for any simple word. He looked up at the arena rail. Eli was watching him with the expression Sawyer now knew he kept only for the things he loved most. Sawyer held his gaze across the arena. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Epilogue: What the Ranch Knows. 6 months after Sawyer Maddox drove 4 hours through Texas Hill Country and stepped out of a truck into a ranch he had never heard of, the feeding schedule on the whiteboard had two names at the bottom instead of one. Ghost allowed the two people she had chosen to groom her on alternating mornings, which Danny found profoundly significant and mentioned frequently. Vega competed in her first show and placed second, which Eli said was exactly right for the first time and which he celebrated with the quiet, satisfied certainty of someone watching a long plan bear fruit. Copper's 3 o'clock restlessness had been redirected into a groundwork routine that he had come to love with the particular enthusiasm of a smart horse given an appropriately demanding outlet. Mesa's mane was braided every Friday. Ranger still asked for his nose scratched first, every single morning without exception, and got it. At 4:58 every day, without fail, the barn light was already on. And at 5:30, when 8 horses who knew the time better than any person raised their voices in the collective, particular, entirely self-assured demand of creatures who expect to be fed on schedule, two people moved through the barn together, easy and unhurried and practiced, in the specific wordless efficiency of people who have built something between them that does not require explanation. The ranch was quiet and working and alive. And somewhere in all of it, in the feeding schedules and the training sessions and the midnight conversations and the pre-dawn routine and the simple, radical act of showing up every single morning without fail, something had grown that was patient enough to last. Even tension, hold steady in the middle, the horses come first. And everything else, given time and trust, follows. The end. Bell final hook and call to action. He showed up shaking on the first day. He stayed through every storm. And the horse that trusted no one chose him. If this story reached something inside you, if you felt every moment of the slow burn, every loaded silence, every inch of that closing distance, then you already know what to do.
Like this story so more people find it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Comment below which moment hit you hardest. Ghost pressing her nose into Shore's head or Eli reaching across the table. And the real question, Vega's owner is coming back for the competition results. Shows are bringing someone with her, someone who knew Eli before Hartwell, before the responsibility, before the walls went up, someone who never really left. Thanks for watching and keep watching.